everyone. It is such a pleasure to be here this morning with you and with Mark and Cherry, who are two of my favorite people who I sort of got to introduce to each other and to all of you, courtesy of this event. So we are going to be talking about the tragedy of an antidote to America's criminal justice system. And I want to start off with Mark, who has a kind of amazing and maybe even, I never use this word, but possibly unique personal story and kind of background explanation for the work he's doing now. So Mark, tell us what I'm talking about.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. Well, it's true that everybody working in this area has a personal story, I find, but mine is perhaps a little wilder than most. I have to say that everything I do now is really a second career. It's not what I started out in my life, my professional life, doing. But it all stems to something that comes from my childhood. I have a friend who I've known since we were 3 years old. We were born 9 days apart. We went to lovey-dovey preschool together. We grew up together. But on the first day of our senior year of high school, something horrific happened, which is that his parents were murdered in their own house. And he woke up on the first day of our senior year of high school to find their bodies. And even worse is that by the end of the day, he was in handcuffs, having charged with killing his parents. And the next summer, he was convicted and sentenced to 50 years to life. Now, I believe that my friend Marty was innocent, and I advocated for him. Since there are a lot of journalists here in the room, and I'm on the panel with two distinguished journalists, I should say that at the time, I was a future journalist who was the editor-in-chief of the Purple Parrot, our high school newspaper, which in retrospect, I think deserves a Pulitzer Prize if they can do those retroactively. But I wrote, and I researched the case and wrote that I believe Marty was innocent and that his father's business partner was involved. And it was later proven that his father's business partner hired hitmen who killed his parents. But none of that mattered, because he was railroaded. No one listened to the Purple Parrot, and Marty went in a completely different direction. He likes to say now, Mark went to Yale, I went to jail. And you can't imagine more divergent paths. And I moved on with my life, and I went to graduate school and got a PhD in political science, started to teach at Georgetown as a professor of European politics. Nothing to do with criminal justice, nothing even to do with the US. But this issue of Marty, the story, always sat with me, was eating away at me, and I would tell people about it. And one day I reached out to him, we started visiting, we started writing letters, we became very close again. And one day in the prison visiting room, I made him a promise that changed my life forever. I said, Marty, I'm going to do everything I can to help get you out of prison, whatever it takes. And that actually included going to law school, even though I was already a tenured professor at that point, became a 1L, and I dedicated my life to getting Marty out of prison. And after 17 and a half years that he served, he was exonerated. And there's an incredible, happy ending to that story. And what's amazing also is that immediately he went on and got his college degree, he got his law degree, he's an attorney, a criminal defense attorney, helping others. But we also run a program together at Georgetown, where I've been teaching now for almost 20 years, called Making an Exoneree. And we have our undergraduate students reinvestigate possible wrongful conviction cases. When we started this program, a lot of people thought, oh, this is a cute little exercise. They didn't even believe it was real. They thought it was like a moot court or something. And the first time we taught the course, we used our own experience on both sides of a wrongful conviction. 4 months after the course ended, we had an exoneration. Valentino Dixon walked out of prison thanks to new evidence. He'd served 27 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, and thanks to 3 undergraduate students, he was exonerated. And I have to give one Philadelphia component to the story, because a month after Valentino Dixon's exoneration, I was at Georgetown on the stage with Meek Mill, Philadelphia's own, and we were doing an event talking about his own saga and story and the tragedy of probation, particularly in Pennsylvania. And as they were introducing me, they said that Mark Howard had helped Valentino Dixon get exonerated after 27 years. And Meek Mill turned to me and he said, yo, you helped a dude get out after 27 years? I have a friend in Pennsylvania who's innocent, who's been in for 27 years. His name is Eric Riddick. I said, give me his contact information. Let's see if we can investigate it. We took on the case the next year. A year and a half later, Eric Riddick walked out after 29 years, wrongfully convicted, here, right downtown Philadelphia, thanks to 3 undergraduate students again. A month later, Keith Washington walked out after 12 years. And a year later, Orlando Jones III after 37 years and 2 months. So there's another part of the story, but I've gone on too long. But that's my origin story. It has to do with Marty, my childhood friend, and our dedication to helping other wrongfully convicted people get out of prison. But as you'll hear later, but I want to give Sherry a chance, it goes now far beyond just wrongful convictions and to the humanity of all incarcerated people. but that's
Thank you, Mark. So that's a little hard to top, Cherry, but you're going to do it. You've been working as a broadcast journalist in Philadelphia for years. You are a host on WHYY. We've talked a lot about this. What are the harms that you see the media contribute to that relate to criminal justice? And I mean harms that we may not even be aware of, that may be very inadvertent, but what are we doing wrong in this area?
Yeah, and I want to start by saying Black and brown people are 12 times more likely to be wrongfully convicted. And there's a reason for that, right? The images that we see of ourselves, the images that society sees of us, has caused people to believe more than likely that a Black and brown person who is a defendant, that they did it. And how did this start? I think about growing up in DC and the images that I saw. A lot of times, if you're a Black or brown person, it's like you're getting arrested, you're a victim of crime, you're protesting some kind of wrong, or you're being railroaded, or those are basically the four stories. And someone who ran a Black press newspaper here in Philly said to me, you would not know that Black people are born, they grow up, they graduate, they own businesses, and they have relatively good lives and lots of joy. And so studies show that Black and brown people are more likely to be depicted in mainstream media as dysfunctional or unstable, and that white people are more likely to be depicted as functional and stable, despite the fact that we use drugs and commit crimes at relatively similar when you measure it. And so how do we change that, right? And that's kind of what we work on with LJJP. I'll tell you how I worked to change it. And I feel like you have to do positive stories every time you do a negative story, right? And we have to talk about root causes. And we have to change the way in which we cover crime. And that's what we're working on with LJJP.
Yeah, so LJJP is the Law and Justice Journalism project. It's a project that Cherry and I started with a few other people for up-and-coming early and mid-career journalists around the country. We picked 16 people. We got an amazing array of applications.
Yes,
we picked 16 people, and we looked for markets that are important. We need some Philly applicants for next year. And we paired them with very experienced journalists in the field. And the idea is to try to provide the kind of training and support and mentorship that is in very scarce supplies in a lot of local and regional and honestly national newsrooms right now, just because of the speed at which reporters work, the financial constraints on media outlets. So we picked people who cover criminal justice and law and crime in particular, because we also understand that it's a very hard beat. It's draining. You get faced with a lot of these kinds of downbeat, kind of grim stories. So we'll talk more about that in a minute. But Mark, we were just saying that you are someone who ends up going into prisons and jails frequently for your work. What do you see there in terms of what you feel like needs to change in the system?
Well, first of all, I go to prisons weekly, sometimes several times a week. I was in the DC jail 2 days ago. I'm going to be in a Louisiana maximum security prison in 24 hours tomorrow. When I go to prison, I see and meet and interact with extraordinary people. People who have made mistakes, have in some cases done horrific things, but people who today, which is often decades later, are representatives of what humanity is capable of. They have character, they have dedication, they have integrity, and they desperately want an opportunity to make amends. But we've set up a system that unfortunately simply doles out punishment. And what I'm trying to do is within that system is to carve out avenues for people to realize that potential. And so I do that with two organizations. One is at Georgetown. I founded the Prisons and Justice Initiative, and I have a slide here that should pop up that just shows a little bit of the programs we run. We run education programs at the DC jail and at a Maryland prison. We have a bachelor's degree program where students become actually enrolled as Georgetown students and will eventually, will graduate with Georgetown degrees from prison. We also have two reentry programs. The Pivot program, which is in business and entrepreneurship, and a paralegal program, which sets people up for careers as paralegals with law firms. And we're breaking down the barrier to entry at law firms, which is actually pretty high. Through that work, I've come to see that if you give people that opportunity, that belief, that support, education as well, that they're capable of success. We will soon have graduated 100 people from our reentry programs. We have 0 recidivism, and we have 100% employment. Thank you. Now, if I can add one more point.
Please.
So that's doing a lot in the Washington, D.C. area, but I've also had the privilege now of bringing in thousands of students to visit prisons in the D.C. area, hundreds of observers, guest speakers. Every single one would walk out saying, that was the most amazing experience of my life. I never knew that there was such a layer of humanity in there. And one time I had a student who said, in the middle of a room where we were interacting, kind of like what you see on the picture on the right, she said, if only the rest of the country could be in this room with us right now, we would no longer have mass incarceration. So I set up an organization called the Frederick Douglass Project for Justice, which actually aims to fulfill that goal by bringing in members of Free Society to prisons all around the country, and we're operating now in Colorado, Florida, DC, Louisiana. We start next month in New York, start soon in Arizona, Hawaii, and we're talking with Massachusetts, Ohio, California, and hope to be all around the country, giving people an opportunity to experience the magic that I have the privilege of doing every single week, which is realizing and recognizing the humanity of incarcerated people and giving them that support that will make them succeed.
I love that. Thank you. Cherry, let's talk a little bit more about LJJP. What are your goals for this program? What do you wish you had had as a younger journalist that you're hoping to convey now?
Yeah, I want to, when I started out as a journalist, I'm also a licensed attorney and I practiced law for a few years before becoming a journalist. And my first, as an intern at Channel 10 here in Philadelphia, my first assignment was to cover a death penalty case. I was sent to cover the murder trial of a Philadelphia police officer, and every day I had to report back to the producer. And every day I would go home and watch the coverage, and I'd see 2 mugshots of people who looked like people in my family. And you hear about this tragic murder of this police officer, and it was very traumatic for me. And so for a lot of people and journalists of color and diverse journalists, covering criminal justice is traumatic. And you don't get into the business to cast this negative shadow over your community. And so it was at that moment that I realized I would have to cover it differently. How could I do that? Well, part of it is going deeper, talking about root causes, talking about trends, talking about solutions, talking about the individuals who were actually overcoming a lot of the things that were happening in their communities. But what I realized is there's a lack of mentorship, there's a lack of training, and a lot of times for journalists who are early in their career, there's a lack of financial support. A lot of people here probably have children who they say, oh, don't be a journalist because you won't get paid, right? Literally, I was president of the Philadelphia Association of Black Journalists, and so many black journalists would leave the business before the 5th year just because they couldn't afford to stay in. And so with LJJP, Law and Justice Journalism Project, we try to solve all of those things. We try to help journalists, diverse journalists, deal with the trauma of covering something like this by giving them the training and the mentorship and support they need to level up their journalism. So they're not just being a parrot of law enforcement, you know, going to a press conference and saying, well, this person got shot on this street. Instead, we give them the tools where they can dig deeper. How do we access records? How do we evaluate data? How do we make connections with the people closest to the pain so that we can level up? We also provide a grant, right, to help keep you in the business until you can get to a place within your career to get more sustainable pay. Because early in, my first 2 years, I was very blessed. I had a lot of support around me, but I didn't make hardly any money. And a lot of us can't afford to do that. And so LJJP helps in all of those areas. We're supporting, I mean, Emily, we've been on those calls. Young journalists dealing with some really heavy stuff like death penalty. How do we keep them together? How do we help them figure out some of these tough questions that are being asked? And a lot of times they don't have that support, but we provide that at LJJP so that they can go on and excel and cover crime in a different way.
Yeah, that is for sure the goal. Yeah. Mark, as you've created this program, I mean, you've described this kind of amazingly multifaceted program, which seems incredibly ambitious, must take enormous energy. What are the key pillars of support? What are the things that you need? Obviously, there's institutional questions of support, financial. Does press coverage matter? Do you need volunteers? Like, how does it all come together?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right that it takes a lot of time and effort and love. It also takes a great team, and I've been fortunate to build, whether it's at the Georgetown program or the Frederick Douglass Project, to have great people who are passionate and dedicated and really share this vision and this mission. But obviously, working in the nonprofit world, it always depends on philanthropy. It always depends on donors, on corporate sponsors, on organizations and people who recognize the importance of this work. For me, my solution to that is come with me inside. I don't even have to pitch. I don't even have to do any of the stuff that makes me feel gross or uncomfortable. I just say, come see it, and then boom, the magic happens and people want to support it. And so, to me, so many of the problems that we have today, the solutions are actually close by. They're in our prisons. And there are over 2 million people incarcerated in this country. Right? There are prisons all over the place. In the 1990s, a new prison was opening every 10 days. It's extraordinary. And you might be driving down 95 and so on. There are prisons that might be 2 miles away and you don't even know it, because those prisons, they might as well be on Mars. They're completely separated. So what I think is so important is to break down that barriers, to sort of do the Elon Musk of transportation to Mars by just going inside of prisons and meeting people, seeing people. And to come back to the question, I do think that journalism is a key part of the solution, because there's a power. Not everybody can go, and there's practicalities and constraints and so on. But I think the camera is very powerful. And more prisons are open to journalists coming in, open to stories being told, open to cameras. And if they're not, they need to be pushed, right? And I will say again, since we're in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania is one of the worst states, if not the worst, in terms of access to prisons. I can't start yet a Frederick Douglass Project program in Pennsylvania. We can't get access. Reporters, news cameras cannot get in to interview people, even people who are innocent in prison and wrongfully. You cannot get coverage in Pennsylvania prisons, which is a scandal. But I think that there's a big part of the solution is here in this room, here on the stage, with people who are telling the stories of those that I have the privilege of meeting on a regular basis, because they're incredible people. They're resilient. They're tough. They're also human. They made mistakes. We all make mistakes. There are different levels of gravity, and some get caught and some don't. But they are dedicated to a better path. And if we give them that opportunity, give them that voice, I think we'll find a lot of these solutions come to fruition.
Cherry, you mentioned before the idea of for every negative story, a positive story. Some sense, I think, of very intentional balancing types of coverage. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that and give some examples maybe of what you mean in terms of more kind of positive, three-dimensional stories that relate to this area. And I can jump in too, since I'm putting you on the spot, I realize.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I have lots of examples. I worked as the community affairs reporter for 10 years, covering, my beat was civil rights. I consider myself a civil rights journalist. And a lot of times I was covering gun violence, I was covering criminal justice reform, I was covering courts, and I was covering crime. But the way that I did it was by making my main sources the people closest to the pain. Instead of running to police press conferences and simply parroting what police said, I would go to the street corners. I would talk to the folks. I would do a story from the victim's perspective, or from someone in the neighborhood on the block who is trying to make a change. And a lot of times we talk about and we cover high crime communities, but they don't realize there was a block party there last week. Everything isn't negative, I grew up in Washington, D.C. and Northeast. I was telling Mark, my father was incarcerated for several years growing up. And I've seen this close up. We went to church every Sunday. We had a lot of fun. And so I spent a lot of time in church basements talking to families. I remember doing a story once about a mother of 7 in Southwest Philadelphia. She was a single mom. She was planning a party because her final 2 children would be graduating from college. That story went viral because who can fault this mother who is a nurse's aide, and I even get goosebumps right now, who worked her behind off, and not 2, not 3, but 7 children she put through college by herself. You know, can we clap for the mom? Yeah, because that is a story that balances the story about somebody got shot. There was a drive-by down the street, you know. That balances the time I spent a summer going to vigils, you know, and balloon releases. And, you know, I also did a story about a t-shirt shop whose sole business was to create the Rest in Peace shirts that people wear and they buy.
Wow.
Because so many, that's how much they were able to create a market on death. You know, those are the types of stories I think that if you're still covering crime, you're still covering criminal justice, but it's different. You know, we're talking about the human aspect. And at no time in a lot of this that I have to interview a police officer or a prosecutor, but it still showed the community impact of what the issues of public safety, the issues of criminal justice, the issue of policing, how it impacts communities. And so that over time built credibility. And so when I did have to do a story about a murder, when I did have to do those other types of stories, people knew where I stood and they knew that I cared and that I would be fair. And so at Law and Justice Journalism Project, part of what we try to do is help people see past the criminal statistics, past all the death, past all the destruction. I've been blessed to be able to go inside of local prisons, the state prison, you were right. Yeah. They will not, I was on a list for months and could not get approval, and I have a pretty squeaky clean, you know, background. But yeah, it's tough to get in and tell those stories. But I used to get teased when I worked at Channel 3 and KYW. They would tell me, Cherry's a jailbreak reporter. Anytime somebody gets out of jail, she's doing the interview. Absolutely.
Those are great stories.
Absolutely.
The hugs, the tears.
And the fact that when someone did it, we're posting their picture everywhere. What about when they get exonerated? What about when the charges are dismissed? Do we clean it up? We need to. And that's what we talk about at LJJP.
Right. I mean, one thing I think is implicit in everything you're saying is that headlines, the way the media puts together the homepage or the front page, there's nothing fair or representational about that, right? It's about the stories we think people want to read, or really our editors think people want to read. It's about what we think is kind of exciting and juicy on that day. And then you can end up with a depiction of that seems one-sided or one-dimensional or grim of a neighborhood where there's a lot of crime, when in fact, obviously, there's also going to be all these other parts of people's lives that are unfolding. But I think you're absolutely right that reporters have to get away from the kind of official channels of coverage, the meetings, the court hearings, in order to see all of that. And it takes some creativity and some willingness to knock on people's doors and kind of...
And make friends.
Yeah,
well, be friendly, I should say, because we're typically not friends, but be friendly and have sources outside of police. There's a whole apparatus set up for us to receive information and to build a narrative that's government focused, right? How do we change the narrative? Well, we have to change our sources, diversify who we talk to and who we talk about.
Absolutely. And Mark, I think that you have done some of this with some of the folks who you represent, whether they're still incarcerated or out, trying to put them at the center of the stories you're telling.
Yeah, no, following on what Sherry said, I completely agree that one of the problems with what maybe we can call the old approach to journalism was just relying on police and prosecutors as sources and not wanting to burn a bridge there, not wanting to question them, because that's where you're going to get the break on your competitor by getting the scoop from them and putting it into the headlines. I think that, one, we've learned that there are so many mistakes that happen, right? And so that is a problem that is of epidemic proportions. The estimates are about 5% of incarcerated people were innocent of the crime they were convicted of. That should really, really trouble you. Also think about death row. There have been hundreds of people exonerated from death row. I'm representing and involved in 3 people currently innocent on death row in different states. That's just horrific. But I think that more than just not relying on sort of the negative sources, I think we need to seek out the positive sources. There is so much inspiration, so much humanity that entrepreneurial journalists, creative journalists can go find. And there's that old trope, if it bleeds, it leads. But I think inspiration can lead too. And I think we're tired of all these mugshot type stories. And they're extraordinary stories, even of people who are guilty. It's not just about wrongful convictions, but of resilience and overcoming. And so what I try to do is to celebrate success and to recognize that, first of all, each and every person who's incarcerated has a family, has people who love them. Over 50% have children, right? Think about that. They're making calls, they're getting cards, they're connected to their children. Don't we want them to have a positive relationship, to be role models in some way? So why not support them along that journey, or to make their parents proud? I've been around people who are now in our education programs who start bawling when talking about what it's like for the first time my mom was proud of me. Think about that. For my entire life, I was a source of shame. Everyone thought I was destined to fail, from getting into trouble in elementary school to getting arrested in middle school and getting a life sentence in high school. And suddenly, I'm a Georgetown student. And by the way, one thing I always say is intelligence and education are two different things, right? They might overlap sometimes, but I got a lot of students that, Georgetown students who, maybe come from good backgrounds, so to speak, but, I don't know how much is going on there. They're certainly not that dedicated, but I go into prison.
I have that tape that's
it's not being recorded,
when we get back to DC.
But when I go into prisons, they are dedicated. They are so hardworking. It's the highlight. They're not on their phones. They're not thinking about their party tonight. They want to learn for the sake of learning, and it's beautiful. And I'll just have one more slide that I'll show now, which is we want to celebrate success. I mean, look at that photo. Every single person there in a gown, except for a few faculty members, and I'm in there somewhere too, was incarcerated. They were incarcerated, and they had family who loved them, again, children and parents alike and siblings. And they've come out on the other side, and they've been through the Georgetown Pivot program, and they're graduating, and they are now in careers. Some of them have started their own businesses. We need stories, we need focus, we need energy devoted to those people because they're incredible. And I hope you have goosebumps hearing me talk about it. I certainly do while speaking myself. But that's where I think the solutions are in these people and in these stories.
Such a good reminder that the arc of life can be long, we hope, and have different stages in it. We're, I think, ready to take at least a couple of questions in the few remaining minutes that we have. Thank you, Roxanne. Does anyone have a question? Roxanne has a mic. Great.
I'm thinking of the introduction to the discussion on the arts, thinking of what Bill Murray said. If you saw it, if you were here, he said he walked out and he walked into a neighborhood and he didn't think he was going to come out alive. And we all know, he didn't say this, but we know it was a poor Black neighborhood, and it's just an unspoken fear and an unspoken stereotype that we all share. And how we get over that, I don't have a lot of answers. Some of them were very, you offered. But it is so embedded in our consciousness. He didn't have to say that, but we know what he was talking about. And it's been bothering me since I heard it, so I just wanted to raise it with the group.
That is a good and deep question, and thank you for your honesty. I think it's something that we often sort of don't talk about out loud because it's a hard one to grapple with, a hard one to admit. I think that it is often really based on stereotypes. I wonder, Cherry, if you have thoughts.
I mean, I get nervous too. So, I still have to protect myself, right? But what I do know is that I provide everyone with respect. No matter what neighborhood I go in, one of the things that I do is I say, "How you doing, sir? How you doing, ma'am?" And people see me and they know, I feel like everything is gonna be okay. And most people are good people. I truly believe that. And sometimes when you're in neighborhoods that are tough and that have been under-resourced, it can seem scary, but for the most part, like I said, most people are good. But it's okay to be, I would say it's okay, like some nervousness and to be vigilant is good, but I do think we have to combat some of those stereotypes that have been embedded in media for generations.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that there's some balance between being naive. You don't want to put yourself at
Exactly.
risk, right? Like if it's late at night, if you're on, I mean, honestly, I feel this way anywhere. Late, if it's dark and there's nobody on the street, I don't care what neighborhood I'm in, I'm going to be
vigilant.
looking around. Yeah, vigilant. But I also have found whenever I'm in neighborhoods that seem poor, that most people like want to be helpful, and if you make eye contact and you smile and you make it clear that you are not a threat, that you're a guest, that people tend to respond to that. I mean, I don't want to say everyone in every circumstance, but I've done a lot of reporting that way.
And I will tell you, I was in the middle of the unrest here in Philadelphia. Fires were going on, all sorts of things. And I mean, a lot of times, I mean, people protected me. The people
Yes.
in the neighborhood
Yes, that happened.
literally protected me. And so I just think that that level of respect that you give to folks and that you treat people, you know, like they're humans and that you don't expect anything bad to happen while being vigilant, I think it helps a lot with building those brief relationships.
Right, and it's important for journalists to have those skills and have a little bit of that faith because we need to be out there. Otherwise, you're just gonna be staying inside where it's safe, and that's not where the stories are. I don't know, Mark, if you have.
Yeah, I mean, that leads me to something that I hear a lot. And the first few times I heard it, I thought, no, this can't be true. This is hyperbole. But I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say, prison saved my life.
Yes.
And
That's probably-
what they mean by that is that their childhood was so filled with trauma and destruction, violence, and loss of life that being extracted from that kept them alive. Even if it was actually being extracted for being convicted of that very same crime. And the number of people who have said, I knew I was either going to be dead or in prison, and literally meaning it. This is not, again, hyperbole. This is a real, that's the life path for many people. But here, I want to come back to, and you can see I try to be hopeful and find optimism
Good.
in these depths of despair at times. But as Emily said, life is long if you can
Yeah.
make it through that, right? And I would never, ever advocate for prisons. I want to be clear on that. But surviving that really, really dangerous phase of sort of adolescence and early adulthood is something that can allow people later to go on and adapt, change, grow up, mature, and in different circumstances actually succeed and thrive. And I think we need to find the ways to protect our children and protect communities, to get them there to that later stage, more of them alive, healthy, not in prison. But even for those who do wind up going to prison, there is still hope. I think there's hope in every human being in whatever the circumstances. And I think we need to see that life has a series of journeys, and there's some ups, there's some really low downs, but you can continue to rebound.
All right, I think that is an excellent, hopeful note to end on. Thank you both so much. Thank you all for being here.